So for those of you who are just now joining, we're going to go over what the essentials is and all that good stuff again. So if you were here at the start of the workshop for Bethany's, you can take a little bit of extra time for a quick break. Go refill that coffee. Um, hi everyone. Welcome to the Essentials, free online classes on navigating the photo industry and beyond. This is our fifth season, and it's all been made possible by partnering with grassroots photo organizations working toward inclusivity, equity, and access in the media. So that is the Everyday Projects, Black women photographers, and photo wings. My name is Danielle Biasana, and in addition to my work as a photojournalist, I'm also a community team member of the Everyday Projects, which is a global community of visual storytellers, all committed to using imagery to combat harmful misperceptions and to rise above persistent inequality, which is like an amazing goal to have through photography. And I am here with the one and only incredible, best co-host ever, Polly Arungu, who is the founder of Black Women Photographers and who is doing the work every single day, I should say moment, minute, second, to support and elevate the voices of Black women and non-binary creatives.
Yes. Thank you so much, Danielle. Again, one of my favorite projects all year that we get to do with you guys. So thank you, Danielle, for the beautiful work that you do as well for this industry every second, moment, day. Especially as a mother, I don't know how you do it all, but you do it. So shout out to you. And folks, for who are just joining us, again, every session is being recorded, and these sessions are made free and possible because of our wonderful partner, Photo Wings, who will help us, make these sessions free and accessible to all of you who are tuning in from around the world. So if you are just hopping on, folks, feel free to drop in the chat where you're tuning in from. We love to see the representation across the globe. And again, Photo Wings is a nonprofit organization dedicated to utilizing the power of photography to further deep thinking, communication, and action. Their extensive online content and Photo Wings outreach programs have myriad educational applications and possibilities like this one that you're tuning into this weekend. And all weekend long, we have incredible speakers. We just had Bethany, who literally fired me up. I was fangirling the whole time. She is incredible. If you missed Bethany's session, it was recorded, made available later in the coming weeks for you to replay. But go ahead and follow us on socials, share your gems, share insights that you're taking away. Let folks know that we're here all weekend. So if you have other storytellers who think would benefit from this, feel free to let them know. You can still register to tune into this free weekend of sessions.
Yes. So I love how we're just jumping right into the heart and soul of photography this weekend. Usually we like build up to that, but we're just like, bam, let's just talk about the heart and soul of why we're doing this. First with Bethany and now with our esteemed next guest, Haruka Sakaguchi, who is a beacon in the visual media industry, not only for her incredibly creative and conceptual approach to photography, but also for her courage to speak out against injustice in the world, as well as within our industry. As well as within our industry, to say it for louder for the people in the back. So Haruka, thank you so much for being here with us today. It is an honor. Today, Haruka will discuss how to create photographic work that engages directly with the community, which takes so much care, so much compassion, and imagination. She'll highlight the many forms of community engaged practice, as well as the magic that happens when people's voices are intrinsically incorporated into the photography. So for real, y'all, like buckle up, because Haruka's work, which focuses on cultural identity and intergenerational trauma, is going to amaze you. So if you're not familiar with Haruka's work yet, which I would be surprised if you are not, it's like, just get ready, okay? Go fill your water glass because you need it. But before we jump in, I wanted to just share a little bit of background for those of you who may not know Haruka. She is based in New York City and was born in Osaka, Japan, immigrating to the US at 3 months old. Her clients include the New York Times, National Geographic, Time Magazine, ProPublica, the New Yorker, Smithsonian Magazine, BBC News, Bloomberg, I mean, all of the publications. So wow, Haruka, thank you again for being here. And more than that, just thank you for all that you do. I remember when I saw your posts on Instagram that were highlighting the injustices within our own visual media industry, and I haven't forgotten it. So thank you so much for everything that you do and for being who you are. So it is such a joy and a treasure to have you here with us today. And let me stop my screen because yes.
Danielle, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And yeah, I'm really grateful to be in the company of such talented photographers today, like the presentation that we saw with Bethany. I mean, I'm still kind of processing the obviously the stark beauty of her images, but also how she centers the story in all of her projects. But she somehow, manages to have this clear visual through line, which I mean, is just her work is so yeah, they're just so distinct. And I also really want to thank Everyday Projects, Photo Wings, and Black women photographers for all your hard work and dedication bringing this workshop together. The photo day industry is, as we all know, it could be incredibly opaque, and it's also a very ever evolving industry. So free programs like this really, I think, serve as an equalizer in this industry. I'm a self-taught photographer as well. I know, Danielle, you were referring to this, Polly, you were referring to this, I've logged so many hours on YouTube just looking at basic camera tech content. And I just want to, appreciate all your efforts in bringing this community together. But yeah, I'm just gonna quickly share my screen here and make sure that, okay, so my sound is on. So yeah, as Danielle and Polly generously made the introduction. So my name is Haruka Sakaguchi, and today I'm really excited to be in conversation with you all about how community engagement has shaped my documentary practice. You hear the word community engagement, right? And it's it's a buzzy word that we hear a lot these days, especially I think in industries that pride themselves on equity and inclusion. But the truth is, community engagement is not just an afterthought or a box that you check off at the end of a project to kind of round out your project at the end. True community engagement is actually very foundational, right? It really influences how a project is imagined and shaped from day one. So today I'm excited to talk about how community engagement has been the really primary driving force behind my current project, my current ongoing project, Campu, which is one of the most, I would say, travel intensive, people intensive, and also absolutely exhausting and incredibly exhilarating projects that I've ever worked on. While many of my projects, I would say, have also centered on this idea of community engagement, none have really grown to the scale of Campu. But the thing is, Campu didn't begin with a line out the door of people who were just eager to share their stories with me, as is so often the case, especially with personal projects. In fact, it was actually inspired by a very polite rejection email that I received from a prospective interviewee, which said, after much thought and deliberation, I will have to respectfully decline this interview. So this was an email that I received from an individual while I was on assignment working on a different story, photographing Asian American families in the Atlanta area in the aftermath of the Atlanta spa shootings in 2021. I don't know if you remember, there was an incident, especially, I know a lot of the audience members are from outside of the US as well. There was an incident in spring of 2021 where a white man had opened fire on local Asian-owned spas in Atlanta, killing 8 people, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent. And my assignment was to photograph and interview the families in this area and kind of asking them to reflect on what belonging meant to them in the midst of this kind of pandemic-fueled anti-Asian violence. And yeah, when the interviewee, a prospective interviewee, withdrew his participation, it was a day before our interview date, right? So I was really looking forward to this interview, and the day before, I get this email from this individual, and I'm not gonna lie, it felt like a punch in the gut. I started to spiral, thinking, was it something that I said? Was it a poorly worded email? Did that follow-up phone call that I made the other day, did that come across as too pushy? Did I scare this person away? And I was really looking forward to connecting with this person, not because he was, really able to provide some unique insights for this particular story that I was working on, but he also was a third generation Japanese American. And he was a direct descendant of the so-called internment camps during World War II. So for those of you who may not be familiar, and especially for audience members who are outside of the US, following Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, he issued an executive order that set into motion the forced removal and the incarceration of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry into camps. So he rounded up 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry who lived in the US into these camps, into 10 camps across the US. And 2/3 of this population were actually US born citizens. And so the interviewee, he was a direct descendant of one of these 10 camps, a camp called Poston, which is in Arizona. And I vaguely knew this information, but of course, after he declined to be interviewed, I spoke to his daughter, just kind of trying to figure out what had happened, right? I was curious what kind of led to his decision to pull out from the interview. And his daughter shared with me that he had a pretty complicated history. So during his family's incarceration in these camps, a part of his family was sent from their original camp in Poston, this is the camp in Arizona, to another camp called Tule Lake in California, because they were deemed no-nos by the US government. What is a no-no? This was also my first time hearing this term, no-no. Well, I learned that no-nos are incarcerees who had answered no to two controversial questions on a document called the Loyalty Questionnaire, which was this document that you're seeing here. It was distributed to the Japanese American incarcerees, right? They were being held in these camps, and it was this questionnaire that was being distributed to them by the War Department to determine which incarcerees, so which one of these people in the camps were eligible for military recruitment for the US Armed Forces. So essentially what's happening here is as World War II is raging on and the US, realizes that their troops are in short supply, the War Department decides to draft young Japanese American men from the camps to fight for the US Armed Forces. And the two questions are, this is a 4-piece document. These two questions at the end, 27 and 28, I'm gonna blow it up right here. But 27, the question is, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty, wherever ordered? And question 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attacks by foreign or domestic forces? And here's the important part. Are you willing to forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, organization? And these two questions, they're quite abstractly worded, and they caused a lot of confusion within the camp population. The Japanese American incarcerees are receiving this questionnaire. They see these two questions, and many of them are confused by these two questions. Because say, for example, if you were a second generation Japanese American, so 2/3 of the camp population are US born citizens, like we talked about earlier. So if you were a second generation Japanese American who was born here in the US, like this man right here, you barely know who the Japanese emperor is, let alone have any kind of allegiance to him, right? So maybe you're inclined to answer yes to question 27. This is the one about the armed forces, to prove your loyalty to the US. But question 28 gives you pause. How do I forswear an allegiance that I never had? Would forswearing allegiance to the Japanese emperor connote that I had an allegiance to him previously? And could that therefore kind of criminalize me, and kind of peg me as a potential saboteur to the US government? Here's another example. Say you were a Japanese immigrant, so someone who was born in Japan who immigrated to the US. Maybe you're willing to swear unqualified allegiance to the United States, but you're also aware that you're barred from ever becoming a US citizen, since resident aliens were unable to naturalize into American citizens until 1952. And so you wonder, would forswearing allegiance to the Japanese emperor mean giving up your Japanese citizenship, which is the only citizenship that you have? And could answering yes to the question essentially kind of turn me into a stateless refugee? So these are really charged questions, as you can imagine, for most incarcerees, right? Whether you're born in the US or not, these questions, frankly, felt like a slap in the face, presented to them after they had already been displaced, pulled out from their homes, and held captive in these remote camps, like you're seeing right here. Now, you're probably thinking, you put me behind barbed wire on suspicions of being a threat to this country, and now you want to know if I'm loyal to that same country? So as you can imagine, some Japanese Americans, they answered no, no to the two questions that we saw earlier, questions 27 and 28, as a form of protest to this stark violation of their constitutional rights. And unfortunately, those who answered no or refused to answer these questions were called no-nos, and they were sent to a maximum security camp called Tule Lake. So in total, there were approximately 12,000 no-nos who were sent to this camp, Tule Lake, some of whom ended up renouncing their US citizenship during the war and were eventually deported to Japan after the war. And these no-nos were stigmatized by the general public, people outside of the Japanese American community, and even members within the Japanese American community, for being traitors to the US government. So I know that was a long, drawn out history lesson, but I really wanted to kind of emphasize this backstory here. Back to the interviewee, right? The person who sent me that polite rejection email. Some members of this interviewee's family had answered no, no to the questionnaire, while others had answered yes. So the no-nos of his family, which included the interviewee's father, they were sent to the camp, Tule Lake, and the rest of the family, they kind of resented them. Part of them, they were blaming their kind of prolonged incarceration during the war, partly on this segment of the family's kind of so-called disobedience to the government. And this created a rift in this person's family that clearly persists to this day, right? So I learned that the interviewee, he ultimately withdrew from my interview because he feared troubling some of his family members by appearing on a major media publication like the National Geographic and speaking about this pretty abstract concept of belonging in America in such a public way. So like many of you, I didn't know about this history until a few years ago. I am a first generation immigrant from Japan. So I was born in Japan, came out here with my family after the war, well, after the war, obviously. So I have no family ties to the camp, actually. So my knowledge of the camps was limited to what I had learned in history class here in the US. That Japanese Americans are, like you're seeing in this slide here, they were displaced from their homes and they were put in camps during the war. I had learned that life inside the camps, it was, lacking but bearable. That even though they were far from home, incarcerees still had access to things like food, shelter, and even recreational areas where they could tend to gardens and even play baseball. What I had learned growing up here in the US is that Japanese Americans, they met their incarceration in these camps with a sense of kind of silence and dignity. And that even led to the coinage of the term model minority after the war. But of course, after having this interaction with this interviewee and learning about the loyalty questionnaire and the no-nos in particular, right? I began to wonder, do I have the complete picture here? I started to ask multi-generational Japanese Americans for their accounts on what actually happened in the camps. I've seen all these black and white photos, right? But I wanted to hear from Japanese Americans, those who had actually survived the camps, who had experienced incarceration. And I learned that the story of wartime incarceration extends far beyond what I was taught in class. I learned that many of the photos that were made available from this time period, like the one that you're looking at here, they were actually staged photographs made by photographers who were commissioned by the War Relocation Authority, the same federal agency that was overseeing the camps. So as you can imagine, a bit of a conflict of interest there. I learned that, not all incarcerees were compliant. I was learning, like I had learned, I was under this impression that everyone had kind of met their incarceration with silence and dignity, but not all incarcerees were compliant. And in fact, some had actively resisted their incarceration and declined to serve a country, to offer military service to a country that denied them of their rights and their dignity. I learned that some Japanese Americans were still reeling from the traumatic events during their incarceration, like witnessing the suicides of their family members during their incarceration, like being separated from their loved ones who had answered no on the loyalty questionnaire and were eventually deported to Japan. I learned that hundreds of Japanese American families, they've been returning to their former camps to this day in the form of pilgrimages to reflect on their incarceration and to commemorate their formerly incarcerated ancestors well after the war, 8 decades after the war. I learned that there's a contingent of Japanese Americans who are returning to these sites, who are making pilgrimages to these sites. And this is the impetus, the backstory, what inspired my project, Kyampu, an American story, which will be presented in the form of an educational website, but it features portraits of survivors and descendants of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. So, as I mentioned earlier, since the end of the war, Japanese American families have been making these pilgrimages back to their former camps. There are 10 camps total. As you see scattered across the country, a lot of them are on the western half of the United States. And some of these camps, they're, carefully kind of stewarded by the local communities and the National Park Service, while other camps are abandoned and vulnerable to things like arson and vandalism. So for my project, I've been photographing the camps as they stand today, and also making portraits of the Japanese American family who journey back to them. I wanted to share with you a trailer that I had filmed while making my first ever pilgrimage with a family to Tule Lake. This is you're about to meet Gregory and Midori Sampson. So I had the privilege of joining on a pilgrimage to Tule Lake back in July of 2022.
I was raised that this is a period of my family's life that we want to forget. Our family is like we never really talked about a lot of stuff, personal stuff. I never knew my parents' birthday, or I never knew anything about their history. You know, I didn't even know how I fit in the family dynamic. All of my siblings all have this tendency to have secrets. And I think that's a lot of what my mom learned, to repress a lot of ideas or attitudes because it's going to get you in trouble. When we named our daughter Midori, my mom had a fit, just went on for a couple months about how this was going to be nothing but trouble for us with her name being Japanese, and why would you do that to her, and so yeah, there's that feeling in there of that this could happen again.
So I think you're probably able to kind of get a glimpse from what Gregory was saying about how many Japanese American families didn't talk about their incarceration after the war. And, this would be for different reasons, but a lot of families, they stayed silent in order to protect their children and their grandchildren from the deep humiliation, really the shame and the stigma that comes from incarceration. And as a photographer, I was faced with some pretty big challenges. Now, the first question I was grappling with, how do I document this intergenerational silence, which is an essential part of the story, as you could probably kind of tell from hearing Gregory here. How do I document this through still portraiture? I was also grappling with, how do I dismantle this myth of the monolith? What I had been taught in school as well, that the idea that Japanese Americans, they all responded to their incarceration in a similar way. And I was also grappling with the question, how do I address the more complicated, nuanced, and perhaps controversial aspects of wartime incarceration, like the loyalty questionnaire that we were just talking about? I had just spent 15 minutes talking to you all about this. And, it took me a long time. It took all these slides to talk about it. And how do I encapsulate all of what I had just talked about in through photography in a photo, right? And, these are the kind of deep, nuanced challenges that still photography alone can't fully address. So I mulled over these questions for weeks, really kind of wondering how the hell I was going to address these topics. And then one day I stumbled across a letter that I hadn't opened in years. It was a handwritten letter from my mother that I had received when I left home at age 18. I guess it's worth prefacing here that I wasn't exactly an easy teenager. My favorite band was Rage Against the Machine. I had a huge distaste for authority and a strong preference for leather jackets, as you could probably tell. I remember while my mother's friends, immigrant daughters, were heading off to all these prestigious colleges, right? I kind of scoffed at the idea of post-secondary education and went to go work as a farmhand in Japan instead. So I think, she wasn't too thrilled about that. I'd always seen, especially at this age, I'd seen my relationship with my mother kind of defined by silent disappointment. But, she gives me this letter, and in this letter, my mother's words were tender. and affectionate. Now, it was a stark contrast to our daily kind of surface level exchanges. And now I realized that our relationship isn't the sum of our conversations. Now, that some feelings can't be spoken, that they're meant to be written down. So this realization inspired an idea to ask the participants to handwrite a letter to accompany their portrait. I began asking survivors to write a letter to their younger selves in camp, and descendants, so for those who didn't experience the camps, to write a letter to the survivor that they're commemorating on their pilgrimage. And through this letter writing practice, I think we were able to uncover the nuanced topics that we just talked about, the intergenerational silence, the myth of the monolith, the loyalty questionnaire. And we were able to reveal a layer of lived history that a formal interview wouldn't be able to quite capture. The project became more than just a kind of retelling of historical events, and it became an intergenerational tribute to all of those who survived the camp. And to showcase this in the most intuitive way, instead of kind of presenting these portraits as loosely as individual portraits, I compiled them into family profiles where readers can learn about one family's incarceration experience from a multi-generational perspective. And I like to do a quick walkthrough of this here. I'm going to quickly stop sharing my screen and head over here. I'd love to walk you through what the family profile looks like. And I think I hope the sound is coming through. Okay. So are you seeing the screen that says the
Yes, we can see
profile?
Yeah, we can.
Perfect.
Yeah, we can see the screen, but I don't hear any sound just yet.
Oh, okay, got it. Let me see if I'm just gonna scroll this right here. Can you hear this?
Dear young Khan.
Yes, yes.
Perfect. All right, so yeah, the family profile, all the family profiles take on this format here. It starts with, opens with a group photo. This is a family that I had a chance to join on a pilgrimage to a camp called Rower in Arkansas. We have the survivor Kazuo Ideno here sitting in the center with his daughter Karen on the right and his grandchildren Jacqueline and Blake here on the left. So as I've been joining these families as they're making a pilgrimage to the site. So I've been asking them to sit for a portrait at the site. This is at Rower, and to pose for a family photo. And then as you scroll down the page, so you hear from the survivor initially. So Kaz here, he was incarcerated here in Rower when he was 2.5 years old after he had been displaced from his home in San Francisco and the war broke out. So he and his family came to Rower. Yeah, he dedicated his letter, as I've been asking all survivors to do, to his younger self, to 2.5-year-old Kaz. And this is in his own handwriting. And I've also been making audio recordings of each person reading out their letters. So I think I'm going to let Kaz's letter play out so we can listen to this portrait.
Dear young Kaz, you are not responsible for Japan starting World War II against the United States. Unfortunately, because you were only 2.5 years old when you were incarcerated, you developed a sense of guilt and shame during your formative years after leaving camp. You spent many years trying to prove you were a patriotic American, such as refusing to take Japanese language classes and legally adding an American first name when you turned 15. It took years for you to realize your Japanese American culture has always been an important part of who you are. The influence of your parents still carries on in you, as well as the responsibility to pass on Japanese American culture to your children and grandchildren. Love, Kaz.
So, yep, each portrait is followed by this audio player where you can essentially listen to the portrait. And then as you scroll down, you get a little more background information about Kaz. So as I mentioned earlier, Kaz was born in San Francisco in the Bay Area, and he was 2.5 years old when he was incarcerated here in Rower. Kaz was obviously quite young when he was incarcerated, so doesn't have a lot of recollections from Arkansas, from this camp in Arkansas per se. But shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Kaz's father, he was, a well-known bookkeeper in the Japanese American community. He was a kendo instructor who had ran a local dojo. He was arrested by the FBI shortly after the Pearl Harbor attack. And he was separated from his family, detained at all these separate camps than Kaz, his younger brother, and his mother was. So the family was separated for over a year and a half. And so when the family finally reunited in Texas at a camp called Crystal City in Texas, Kaz shared with me that he remembered his father looking beaten down, had kind of undergone this drastic transformation. And it wasn't until many years later when Kaz had learned that during his time being separated from his family, his father had been stabbed in the back by a drunken guard. He was also ordered to dig a burial site for fellow incarcerees who were shot by a guard. And, that had really kind of changed the trajectory of his life. Kaz had shared that, before the incarceration, his father had a lot of, bookkeeper, kendo instructor, active community member, right? And after the war, that it was all menial jobs, that he'd lost a lot of ambition. So we were able to get some insights, not just about what was happening in the camps, what were the barracks like, what was the food like in camp, which is obviously an important part of the history as well. But I wanted to share that, there were a lot of family dynamics at play. There was cases of family separation. There was, in Kazuo's mother's case, having to single-handedly navigate being incarcerated in these camps with 2 young children. So yeah, there's a lot of family narratives that we were able to uncover together through these interviews. And as you scroll down the page, so this document that you're seeing here is called a final accountability roster. And it's essentially an alphabetized list of all the Japanese American incarcerees who were held in camps during the war. It was released by the War Relocation Authority, by the federal agency that was overseeing the camps after the war. And as you can see, we have Kazuo's name here, Kazuo Hideno. Shizuo Hideno is his younger brother, and his mother, Ayako Hideno. And you see, their date of birth. You see where they were incarcerated, or where they lived before their incarceration, where they ended up going after their incarceration. And this document is quite essential, especially if you are a descendant of a Japanese American survivor of the camps, and maybe your family didn't openly speak about their incarceration. This document serves as a starting point for many descendants to really uncover their family history and their, how their families' kind of migration patterns after the war. And Kaz is actually one of those, we had a rare opportunity. He had photos of himself at camp. So this is actually Kaz in his little boots here on the right with his younger brother, Shizuo, posing in front of their barrack in Rower, where they were held during the war. And then as you scroll down the page, now we start to hear from the descendants, right? So this is Karen, Kazuo's daughter, who, like I had asked all descendants to share a letter that they dedicated to the survivor that they're commemorating here on this pilgrimage. So Karen had dedicated her letter to her father. And then, yeah, the family profiles kind of take on the similar format. You can listen to Karen's letter in her own voice. And then as you scroll down the page, we hear from Kazuo's grandchildren. So Jacqueline here dedicating her letter to her grandfather. And then the youngest of the family, we have Blake here dedicating his letter to his grandfather. So I am going to switch back over. Give me one moment here. Okay, great. Great. So are we all seeing a white screen, I hope? Okay, perfect. So let me just one second. Yeah, so as you could tell from the family profile and just the different kind of family history, Kazuo's family history that we were able to uncover through the text and through the letters. Without this community input, right, there was really no way that I could effectively tackle the three questions that we were discussing earlier. This idea of how I should document this intergenerational silence. This question of how do I challenge, dismantle the myth of the monolith idea? The Japanese Americans all responded to their incarceration in the same way. And the final question, how do I address the more nuanced realities, the nuanced aspects of the incarceration, things like the loyalty questionnaire? How do I encapsulate all of this through still photography? And this is where the community input came in. And instead of asking, how do I bring the community into an existing project, which is something that I think this was an approach that I took, unfortunately, in the early stages of my career. How do I already have this concept of a project? I already have this idea of a story that I want to work on, and how do I bring the community into it? Now, instead of asking yourself this, I invite you to reframe this question and think about, what is the gap between what I can show and what I want to say? In the case of Kampu, here's what still photography could show. I could show that through making these portraits of the Japanese American families who are returning to these sites, that there are Japanese Americans revisiting these sites through pilgrimages. I could also, by photographing the camps and the way they look today, I could portray that there are 10 camps across the US and they're in different stages of preservation. And, there's some things that you could do visually through photography. You could probably kind of get a sense of the healing and closure and the kind of catharsis that comes from these pilgrimages through portraiture. But there was a lot more that I wanted to convey through this project. I wanted to talk about and address how many Japanese Americans, they never really openly spoke about their incarceration after the war. I wanted to convey that the Japanese Americans, that they're not a monolith, right? That their responses to incarceration, it wasn't just about silence and dignity. It was varied, it was personal, and it was incredibly complicated. And I also wanted to touch on the more controversial and nuanced aspects of wartime incarceration, things like the loyalty questionnaire and how Japanese Americans have had to, like Kazuo had shared with us, had to really redefine belonging in America over multiple generations. And it's this space, right? This gap between what the photographs can show and the story that we want to tell. This is where true community engagement happens. Now, I'm proud to say that this letter writing practice and the family profiles that the Japanese American families and I had compiled together, this format had really resonated with my collaborators. And the website, which is set to launch next February, it will include over 80 portraits and stories. So community engagement, it's not limited to collecting letters and building websites like the examples that I had shared with you today. It can take on many forms, depending on the type of story that you're telling, right? So some of the most powerful examples that I've seen from photographers that I deeply admire include projects like Daniela Zelkman's Signs of Your Identity, which portrays First Nations residential school survivors through multiple exposure portraits. I know Bethany was sharing with us a little about her, her multiple exposure portraits as well. It's a really compelling kind of visual technique to be able to blend, in Daniela's case, blending images of the survivors with the sights and memories that they carry from their boarding school experiences. And, I just adore this project because I think it's a stunning example of what community engagement could look like in visual form. Now, we also have work by another photographer I deeply admire, Aaron Yoon, To Be at War. And, this project, it explores the social impact of war on military families here in the US. And now, aside from conducting these community programs like photography workshops and community-led exhibitions featuring photographs made by the families that she collaborated with, Aaron had also built this stunning interactive website that shares these first-person narratives of active duty soldiers, veterans, and their spouses, parents, family members, people in their periphery through their personal belongings, like you're seeing here, and photographs from their family archives. So Aaron's kind of multimedia approach to community engagement really kind of immerses us into the lived experiences of those in the military community. And Cynthia Santos Briones' project, Herbolario Migrante, it explores how traditional herbal medicine has been interpreted and preserved by migrant communities. So this project, I think, is stunning because it transcends photography, as you can see it, and includes what you're seeing here as a community herbal book that kind of weaves together, quite literally weaves together stories, poetry, and ancestral knowledge of traditional herbal medicine that were authored, that were written down by migrant women during a series of workshops that Cynthia had facilitated. So when thinking about community engagement in your documentary practice, I really invite you to reframe the approach. Don't do what I did early on in my career and think about, okay, I already have this concept for a project. How do I bring the community into this? No, it's not an afterthought, right? It's not a step to check off at the end of your project. Now, I invite you to ask yourself, what is the gap between what I can show and what I want to say? This gap is where real, meaningful community engagement happens and where the most impactful storytelling begins. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
I know.
I'm
I'm like,
speechless.
wait. I'm over here thinking about that question still. Like, hold up. That's very profound. Oh my God. I think we all have some homework to do. I mean, look at the chat. Everybody's saying like, whoa, hello, I got some homework to do. Like that is just amazing. Oh my goodness. Danielle. And me and Danielle were like texting each other, like, oh my God, like this is so emotional and thoughtful and thought-provoking. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I hope I didn't bore everyone with the historical
no.
details
Oh,
because
no.
I know it's just
like
so much
homework to do.
Yeah.
Oh, you again, like towards the end when we're saying our goodbyes and you can just tune Polly and I out, look through the chat. I mean, people were saying, for example, we like the research behind this is the type of an intentionality that I love to bring and want to continue expanding in my practice. Okay, get ready for this one. As a descendant of family members of Tule Lake, this work and the telling of this history means so much. Coming from Kashmir, this story resonates so much. And then someone said, I'm working on a project on cultural bereavement, and this resonates with what I've been working on as a first-generation Haitian Creole immigrant as well. Yeah, so, oh no, you, the absolute opposite.
Yeah.
Everyone is just like,
I will certainly share those words with me. I
Yeah.
really appreciate that.
And it's like what we were talking about in the previous class, like, some of this thought process, their research, you don't get to see when you post the work after the fact. Like, we didn't get to see this process and this intentionality, and it's just like mind-blowing, like every detail that you went into. And I'm like, yeah, I'm still seeing the chat, like it's still going.
that's like crazy. It's like so fast, you can't keep up.
Okay, let me see. I know we have so many questions, so let's just dive in with the time we have with you. And again, if you have any questions, just drop them in the Q&A box. Continue to show love in the chat and on social. Somebody says your work is so intense and covering really hard injustices and it is personal. How do you deal with dealing not only with the other people's trauma, but when you may be also experiencing personal pain and sadness, how do you practice self-care?
Yep. So I think this is a question that I've been thinking about a lot, and many of my colleagues have been thinking about. We've discussed this. I know Danielle, you and I have discussed this through various collectives that we're a part of. But this idea of secondary trauma is real in our industry, and I think really wholeheartedly acknowledging that that is a thing. That this is not you being a snowflake millennial. This is a very real aspect of working in this industry. I think that's a really important distinction to make, especially when you're working with these types of sensitive topics. So I think, yeah, acknowledging that what you're feeling is real and that there are going to be residual effects of the storytelling that you're engaging in. I think that that is a very important first and important necessary step. And I think in terms of more of the logistical side of things, so I think early on while I was working on this project and also many past projects that I've worked on, I really tried to immerse myself as much as I could. There was another project that I worked on that took place in Japan. So I was making these, 13-hour flights to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and spending, a week and a half, maybe up to a couple weeks there and working on this project and meeting people. And I remember during this period, I would be on 24/7. I'm obviously trying to make the most of this trip as well, but I would just be constantly just with feelers out, just constantly on, and not giving myself time and also grace to just take breaks and isolate myself if need be. Back to back interviews and photographing individuals, it's really taxing and it does take a toll. This other project in Japan that I was telling you about, there was about 6-month hiatus that I had to take because I had really burnt myself out during the first few trips. So yeah, I think acknowledging that secondary trauma is an aspect of your documentary practice, and also remembering to pace yourself and to give yourself time and grace to kind of separate yourself and isolate yourself if that's the way that you recharge. I think these two things have been a big learning curve for me over the past several years. And I hope that's something that you could kind of incorporate into your practice as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad that this question came up, and it's so important, right? Because if we're not well, like we can't do this work that is so important and so impactful. So just to plug also for those, don't go away, because on our next session, Corinne Chen will also be touching on the aspect of self-care. And So kind of switching gears a little bit, maybe getting more into like nuts and boltsy stuff. But you mentioned, for example, that you were in Japan researching. So your projects entail an incredible amount of research, preparation, thought. Like you're not just like jumping in and making the work and then trying to get the work out there. So how are you supporting like yourself in the beginning of these phases, like financially, or how are you talking with editors at the same time? Like you are Haruka Sakaguchi. Like I'm sure at this point, if anyone gets an email from you, they're going to open it. But everyone starts from somewhere, right? So how did you build that? How did you start these projects without having support in the beginning? How do you support them now? So just help us tackle that.
No, absolutely. And this is a, topic that I still very much grapple with today. I wish that were the case where I could just, send someone an email and I'm getting 10 emails back. Like that is definitely not the case. Especially with these very specific stories with a very specific storyline. I have, and I think I'm still in the process of learning not to take it personally if I don't get a call back or if an editor doesn't reply back to an email, because it is all about timing. Each publication, each media organization has their own objectives and their own editorial calendar, and sometimes the timing isn't right. It's not a judgment on your work or your character. Or your relationship with the editor, but it's just simply not the right time. So that's something that I still have to, as much as I'm kind of standing on this pedestal and saying this, I still very much have down days where I'm like, oh my goodness, I've been trying to pitch this for a long time and no one's picking it up. But one thing, so my trajectory is like, I'm not sure if I would recommend this to other people, but this project in Japan, where I was traveling to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's a project called the 1945 Project. I was working with atomic bomb survivors in the area. And at this point, I started research for this project in 2015, 2016, and then released the kind of first chapter in 2017. I had no funding. It was all personal funds. So I would have translation gigs in Japan. And then I would just book an extra, 4 or 5 days or so. And then trying to build relationships with nonprofits out there. And then if I were able to schedule a couple of meetings and interviews, then I would maybe book a week or 2 out there. But it's just, it was all self-funded. I think my first kind of form of payment for that project came when it was published on time. And that would still, obviously that would not cover all my flights and all the time that I had spent. So the way that I had kind of looked at that project was that this was me building my portfolio. This was me building I know Bethany had mentioned, the word brands, and I know we're all kind of cringing a little bit by this, but I think editors also need to have a kind of a distinct like visual profile of what your work is like. And I think I saw that as a kind of investment to build my own visual through line and what I guess the visual through line of my work would look like. So yeah, that project was fully self-funded. This project, Campu, I had received a grant from National Geographic Society. They no longer offer the level 1 grant, I believe, but it was a storytelling grant from that organization. And that had been very helpful because filling out the application, it's one of the more labor intensive grant applications. You really have to clarify what your intentions are with the project. And actually community engagement is a big part of the application as well, where you really have to identify like what you plan to do with this project. What are your impact goals for this project? How are you going to involve the community that you're working with? And I think that has really helped me really clarify my intentions with the project before making my first frame. So I guess this is kind of a mixed response. Like, yeah, in my case, I definitely had to invest time and my own money for my first project. But I definitely recommend, once you are able to also identify for yourself, right? Like, what are the types of projects that you would want to receive commissions for? What are the types of projects that you want editors to know you for? Then it makes it a little easier for you to step into, these grant application processes where you're really able to identify and clarify what your intentions are behind the project.
Thank you for that. And I know people are like, okay, then there's how do you apply for grants? We have classes on that, y'all. So we won't dive into that right here, right now. We have past classes in this series on that touches on grants, that touches on funding, that touches on applying for all these different things to seek that. So again, go to our sites, replay our past seasons on that, because we won't be able to dive into that here and now. But those are great past classes that you can tune into for insight on that. Because we are almost at time, I do want to ask some of these questions. Somebody dropped in the chat, like you mentioned, being self-taught. At any point in your practice, have you sought out technical training or mentorship?
My mentorship, yes, and it wasn't necessarily a technical mentorship, of course. Like, I've had kind of long-standing relationships with photo editors who have been in the industry for a long time and who are able to really help me make connections between, okay, so I have this project, I have this story that I want to pitch, and who do I approach, how do I approach these people, how do I kind of craft my pitch around this product. So that is where I think mentorships for me have really been incredibly helpful, and I'm really deeply appreciative for. As far as technical skills, like I had mentioned earlier, a lot of it YouTube University right here. And which is why I'm so grateful for programs like this, because there is a wealth of, especially with camera tech. I know I keep referring back to a project that I didn't share today, which is kind of horrible, but this 1945 project with the atomic bomb survivors. If you go to 1945project.com, you'll see that all the portraits they have this black backdrop and, this very limited, like maybe a sliver of lighting on the individual's face. And that was actually a technique that I picked up on YouTube, where I learned this term low-key lighting for the first time. It was some like 18-year-old like camera enthusiast who was making this homemade video on YouTube being like, have you heard of low-key lighting? It's this thing where you just really underexpose the shot and just make sure you have a really narrow concentrated ray of light on the person that you're photographing, and you can pretty much recreate a black studio-like backdrop anywhere. So the atomic bomb survivors from that project, a lot of them, especially in Japan, it's very difficult to get access into people's homes, especially when you don't have a trust or rapport with them. So what I would do is I would meet up with them in like public parks or in a conference room or in a public place, and then have them sit down and just make sure there's a lot of distance between the individual and whatever the light would hit behind them, drop off, and making sure that the light is illuminating them in the way that I had mentioned, and that's how I made most of my portraits there. There was no studio work. I wasn't booking studio. I wasn't like the only equipment that I had was a singular key light strobe and my camera. So like there is this lot of information out there about, especially when it comes to tech. But I would recommend seeking out mentorships and not, just cultivating relationships with editors, maybe, or with curators if you want to go into the art. It's not necessarily just photographers, but making sure that you're kind of diversifying the people that you're cultivating relationships with. I'm sorry, these answers are so long-winded.
No need to apologize. There's another question here that you kind of already touched on in your presentation, but because a lot of folks are still like me included, like, wow, mind-blowing work that you've done. How much research goes into your projects? How do you know when you're like done, if you're ever done? Do you fully research before starting, or do you just sort of like just do it simultaneously? What is your process on that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think it kind of goes back into how community engagement is such a formative part of the process, right? And I really think the research is there isn't really these clear striations between, okay, here's the research phase, pre-production, production, and then post-production phase, especially with these personal projects, because it does rely on these kind of spontaneous moments. In the Campu case, the stumbling across a letter that my mother had written me when I was 18 years old, like that was not part of the pre-production schedule. But that had really formed the way that I at least conceptually approached the project. And then that had also informed the way that I do research for the project as well. I think before that, I was looking at a lot of archival material from the National Archives and trying to form as much of a cohesive and historically accurate kind of a visual archive of the camps. And these pilgrimages, the history of the pilgrimages. I remember my first iteration, I was like really fascinated by the fact that these pilgrimages have been going on since 1969, and they were inspired by Japanese American student activists. Like I was actually like very historically aligned. It wasn't really centered on the families, but it was like there are these things called pilgrimages. Like isn't that such a fascinating topic, but then thinking about encountering this letter and then through the conversations with the families, it took on more of a family-centered approach, hence the end product being the family profiles, aside from, things like a historical timeline or there being an abundance of more archival images. So I hope that answers your question, Polly.
Yeah, for sure. And opens up more. It's like there's never enough time. Thankfully, we do have a little bit more time. And so your work has so much impact, and it's like there's like different layers of impact. It's they're educational for people who may not know about these issues or know only a little bit about these issues. And then you also have the layer of impact for the individual. I mean, it seems like a lot of your work is even just healing for people who are participants or involved in the work. I mean, even your project about typecasting, so again, we've dropped Haruka's website a few times. Please check out all of her other projects. Typecasting is like one of my favorite projects that you've done as well. So I know you were talking a lot about true community engagement is not an afterthought, but was seeing your projects as a form of like healing for people, was that just something that you were like, oh wow, like that happened, or is that part of the intention? And then it's a two-part question. So that's the first part. And then the second part is, as photographers, especially sometimes we feel like our work, a photograph isn't enough. So how do you deal with those feelings of like, it's not enough? How can I do more? How can I make sure that it's heard and seen?
I definitely hear you. And I might want to echo what Bethany was saying about how she, sees the relationship between a photographer and a collaborator as one that has to benefit both parties, right? And that really resonated with me as well, because I think that is the ideal. And I think that should be the kind of baseline expectation of how photographers approach the individuals that they photograph. If you're not both leaving the room feeling uplifted or elevated in some way, then there's something fundamentally wrong. So yeah, I think that's something that I do think about as far as like healing being the main intention. I think there is a level of catharsis that I hope, both honestly, not just the collaborator, but like myself, I also want to, through these relationships that I'm cultivating, like I'm a human as well, and I have my own fears and anxieties and vulnerabilities. And I feel like a lot of this letter format, the typecasting project that you mentioned, this format of kind of recreating the costumes really that the actors are having to wear to these casting auditions. The format of the collaboration is often shaped from these initial conversations where I'm usually kind of sharing my vulnerabilities. Like the Campu project was also inspired. It was mainly inspired by this rejection email, of course, when I kind of had the chance to historically learn about the loyalty questionnaire. But from a personal standpoint, I actually, my family told me that they're permanently relocating to Japan around this time, leaving me to be the only family member left in the United States. So I was also going through these personal questions of like, I'm grappling with, do I do the, good Japanese eldest daughter thing and follow my parents to Japan and make sure they're being taken care of, or do I honor the relationships that I cultivated here in the United States over the past 3 decades, right? And as I'm thinking about this, I'm like, okay, well, I really am curious to learn from other multi-generational Japanese Americans about, how they've defined belonging here in the States, why they decided to stay here in the United States despite losing everything during the war. So I think, yeah, a lot of these conversations took place from a real, like we were both just kind of sharing in a lot of the interviews. I don't usually just kind of walk in with my little notepad and go, okay, question number one. It usually starts with a pretty vulnerable conversation about where I'm coming from, and what's motivating me to research and learn more about this topic.
Wow. Yeah, it's again, like you, Bethany, I love the intention and the authenticity that you both put forward in your work, and just engaging with with the topic, the issue, the people photographed, right? That there's just so much intention, which is why the work just is so powerful, right? It's not just like, oh, well, let me try this thing, right? It's like, okay, let me really like get into this. And so we are just so grateful to have an insight into how you do that. And thank you again so much for sharing your incredibly powerful work with us. I mean, it's truly a privilege and honor to just get a peek into your brain, your heart, your soul, how you do this. And it's been so inspiring. So thank you again so much. And I just gotta say, we also love 18-year-old Haruka. Like, that photo was amazing. So thank you also for sharing
I
that.
was like, should I do that? Am I doing this? Am I doing? Okay, you know what?
Oh yes. We're so glad you did. It was awesome.
Okay.
Love the vulnerabilities that you shared with us today. It's really, yeah, we appreciate that.
Thank you so much for having me. Again, I really appreciate you organizing this program. I'm sure it's a lot of work with behind the scenes and the work of you and Polly. And yeah, thank you for bringing all of us together.
So after a short little break, we will be starting the next class with Corinne Chin. But Haruka, please, take a moment to look at the chat for real, because it is like so amazing. But yeah, our next speaker will be Corinne Chin, who will be sharing an incredible wealth of information on how to keep yourself safe, something every single one of us needs to know and probably needs to know more of, because it's not just she'll be going over keeping yourself safe in the field, digitally, online, and with your own heart and soul. We wanted to once again thank our partner Photo Wings, whose mission it is to highlight and help facilitate the power of photography to influence the world. We have seen that with Haruka, we have seen that with Bethany, and we're going to continue to see that again and again throughout the weekend. So yeah, thank you, Haruka. Thank you.
Thank you. Really
Thank you
appreciate your
so
time.
much. As Danielle mentioned, we're taking a little 30-minute break because I know folks have been with us for 2 classes back to back. So go drink some water, go stretch, do whatever you need to do, and come back into the same link in 30 minutes for Corinne's amazing session. All of these classes, the first 2 that just occurred today, and the ones coming up in the past classes are recorded. So do not worry, just bookmark our sites. You see that right there? I think there's a slide right there, or the slide we've been sharing.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I should be sharing that slide, but just look in the chat.
No, it's okay.
I'm like reading the chat, like I'm falling down on my job.
No, you are fine. It's also dropped in the chat, but you should already have our sites bookmarked by now. So go bookmark our sites. We will have these classes in the coming weeks fully recorded, and available in Spanish and French as well for our international speakers. So take note, follow us, follow our speakers, share the gems that you're hearing online, tell friends, fellow storytellers about our incredible free series that we've been doing for the past 4, now 5 seasons, and touching on all aspects of our industry. So we will be back in 30 minutes, wherever you
Yes,
are in the world.
what do they say? Like, now for a commercial break, or like what do they say so you come back? Like I don't know. I don't even watch
I mean,
I just want to watch Netflix
who
now.
just
So
doesn't want to see our beautiful faces in 30 minutes?
yeah,
So
yeah. All right,
that's why
thanks
you're coming back.
y'all. Short
So we
break,
will
short
see you
break.
all in 30
Okay.
minutes.
Yes, thank you again, Haruka. Bye.